Hello and welcome to our second episode of the first mass transport to Auschwitz. Today is the 14th of June. We're going to say 1940 because that's where we're heading back to. And where we left you off yesterday is that our prisoners had gone to have a bath in the Jewish bathhouse. They've bathed, they've sat, fell asleep, and now they're being woken up on this day in the early hours. So I'm going to let Zane take you literally to the train station.
So I want our listeners to remember the intro music as you come into this setting here, because I want you to understand that even to today, you are able to walk this route that these prisoners would take from the bathhouse to the train station. And we hinted at it a little bit in the last episode, but the Germans do put out an order that on the morning of the 14th of June, there is going to be a ban from leaving your house and looking out of the window. You're not allowed to do any of it. So it gets very quiet, and we'll talk about this a little bit here in a second, but it's something that you need to be understanding of and know that and think of it this way is that you can hear practically you could hear a pin drop. And so think of that music as we start walking through. And what's interesting about this transition, about this walk to the train station with this transport, is that in that morning, there were ladies from the committee that would distribute white coffee and bread for breakfast. And then after this particular breakfast and after this coffee, the guards would yell and everyone would have to line up into rows of 5 and would begin marching through the streets of Tarnov. And again, because of this order, Tarnov is now going to fall completely silent because the Gestapo has issued an order to the civilians that on pain of death, there will be a total ban on leaving their homes or looking out of their windows. So the streets of Tarnov would be deserted and empty. And all you can hear is the dull pounding of a marching column in an eerie, gloomy silence. And all while this is happening, this convoy is going to consist of police who are going to have guns and fixed bayonets that are ready to shoot. Now, for the most part, most of these prisoners, people like Stanislav Rudniak, wouldn't see anyone on the streets while they were walking. However, during the march, someone sees a window that's open on the second floor of one of the houses and a hand waving to the prisoners. Not sure if it was a relative waving goodbye or what it was, but one of the guards would shoot at this particular window. Again, it's quiet. There's no one around. So you can imagine the shock when one of the mothers of a prisoner would try to get to her son. But of course, the convoy of police would not let her, and both would be in tears. And of course, when they would arrive to the station where the train would already be waiting for them, it's a passenger train, third class. Unlike other situations and other transports, the boarding of this train is relatively calm. It's without beatings and without any shootings. And at this train station in Tarnov, they're loaded into passenger carriers. They're sat in very specific sections and they're guarded by an escort. And they are also not allowed to open their windows. And in these sections on this train, there are between 8 and 10 men and at least 4 to 5 prisoners on each bench. Again, loading is calm, it's orderly, and more importantly, we have photographic evidence of this. And of course, we will be posting some of that on our Patreon account. So be sure to go like, and subscribe. Now, there's also a row where there's a young boy who is from Tarnov who sees his mother through the window and he begins to scream. Tadeusz Krupinski is also on the train, and next to him is someone sitting next to a window. It's a young boy, and to his surprise, he suddenly begins to cry hysterically. Then he begins to pull his hair out, and he begins banging his head on the wooden sideboards. So much so that an SS man has to run up to him to calm him down, and he does this with 2 hits from the butt of his rifle. Tadeusz would later find out that during that journey, the reason he started crying is that he saw his mother, and he saw his mother see him through this window. And the train would leave the station at 9 a.m., heading towards Krakow.
Thanks for that, Zane. This leads us to the actual journey that these prisoners take. And at this point, the train has taken off towards Krakow, and the German escorts are more or less standing in the corridors, monitoring what the prisoners are doing. You know, they can't be rollicky, they can't open the windows. The problem here is that it's really stuffy. So these prisoners can't even open a window to get some fresh air because, God forbid, one of them could jump out of the train, which, oddly enough, one prisoner does just before Krakow. A prisoner manages to escape from the transport. And I stick with the statistics of 728 because that's how many ended up at Auschwitz, but it's 729 that were on this train, with that one person that actually escapes. And funny enough, out of the window, which is why the windows had to be closed. Throughout this whole journey, these prisoners are sitting, talking amongst each other, wondering where they are going. Because remember, they thought they were all going home. They had a bath, they had food, they were getting ready, they got their personal effects back. Yet they're now all sitting on a train heading somewhere, and they don't even know which direction that they're heading in at this point. That is until they hit Krakow, and they arrive in Krakow just before noon. And that is where the whole transport hears the hay now. Anybody of you, or any of you, have been to Krakow, you will know that on the hour, every hour, out of the Mariacki church, you'll hear the bugle and it goes out every single direction out of the highest tower, basically. And it started for the Middle Ages, basically a guard who had to keep watch every day and night on the high tower, watching out for fires, enemies, anything that's approaching Krakow, all various different dangers. And he would also play the bugle call only at dawn and at sunset, which is basically a signal to open and close the city gates. And in 1241, the Tartars actually managed to get to Krakow. It's a whole other different part of history that, you know, we don't have time to talk about today. But the guard who was on duty began to play the trumpet, and it was an alarm basically to say the Tartars are at the gate of Krakow, and the Tartars fired an arrow that basically pierced his throat halfway through his bugle. And that is why the bugle call ends so suddenly at the exact same place where the heroic guard was standing. So you'll never hear the whole thing because of this. So this is what the prisoners, when they're sitting on their third class trains, are hearing the hay now. And as they arrive into Krakow, I'm going to actually let Wiesław Keller tell you the story, because for him it was quite intense. The whole station was festooned with swastikas. There was excitement and undisguised rejoicing amongst the Germans. From the loudspeakers came the blare of the military music and strident speeches. Victory! Paris has fallen. It was June of 1940. We travelled on. Our mood was subdued, not surprising with news like that. Our German escorts, on the other hand, were bursting with delight. So there you go. Can you imagine seeing the whole of Krakow station just festooned with swastikas and the excitement of these German soldiers that are standing on the platform? And people were even firing their guns into the air with delight because Paris had fallen. And the moment those prisoners realize and they hear that information, for them, their world has now fallen apart, because they still believed that they would be rescued by the French, they'd be rescued by the British. There's no chance for them now. Paris has fallen. And nobody believed or at least in Poland, nobody believed that Paris would fall. So for them, it was incredibly shocking. So the mood on this train completely switches from where they're discussing where they're going to now, what have they got really to live for? What they feel they've got nothing to live for. The train then continues towards the general government and the Reich border. By this point, as they know from Tarnów, they've reached Krakow, they've now reached the border, they're now heading west. They're heading west into Germany, but they still have no idea where they're going. By this point, they reach Auschwitz. I'm going to read you a quote from, again, Wiesław Keller, only because I find Wiesław Keller quite a witty writer. Quote, next we stop at what, judging from the number of trucks on either side of the train, must be a major train station. The name of this place, written in large letters on the station building, is Auschwitz. Someone explains that this is Oświęcim, some dump or other. For a book on the first transport, obviously it's quite a traumatic book, but it's those few lines, because Wiesław Keller, when he begins his book, he doesn't begin with his arrest, he doesn't begin with anything else, he begins with his journey. And I find her quite a witty writer, and for a moment you have this little bit of a laugh, and then you really get into the nitty gritty and the darkness of his book. He's a great writer. I highly recommend his book, Annus Mundi, if you can get it in English. It's a very difficult book to get hold of because it's out of print. Annus Mundi, Wiesław Keller. Anyway, coming back to the story. So they reach Auschwitz, and like Keller says, it's some sort of dump or another. They end up going onto the side tracks because the train at this point is now jerking. These tracks have, gosh, they've not been used for a really long time, and the tracks still exist today. You'll still be able to see the tracks that are there. It's if you ever go to Auschwitz with me, I'll be able to show you. And they're unused. They're covered in moss. They're covered in, plants and everything. And they're just, you feel that the train is just going to fall off. The train then stops outside the Monopoly building. The moment it stops, the doors open and hell basically breaks loose. The prisoners are being beaten with rifle butts, they're being kicked and punched. It is such a shock to the system that they've been sitting on this train for most of the day. They've experienced this sort of beatings, but not to this extent. So many prisoners write in their testimonies that they were shocked. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know where to go, what to say, how to move, where, it was just that moment for them that was incredibly shocking. They head towards the Monopoly building. Now, the Monopoly building at this point is surrounded by barbed wire and it has guard towers. And I did mention in the episode last week that I will explain to you why. Now, the main camp at this point, because Huss still hasn't, completed the main camp, there's no barbed wire in the main camp. There's nothing there. There's nothing ready for the prisoners because he hasn't got anything to be able to do anything with. They have enough barbed wire to put around this Monopoly building. They house the first transport prisoners for a couple of weeks. The Monopoly building is about 300 meters away from the current camp, and right now they've got a school that's housed there, and there's a plaque there, and you can still enter the territory if you're around in that area. I do recommend. The other thing, that it's not just the SS men that are beating them at this point. There's another 30 men. Now, I'm going to read Kazimierz Albin. So, quote, we also noticed a group of people dressed in well-cut blue and white striped uniforms and sailor caps. We were just wondering from where and when a bunch of sailors had turned up here, when at the command of one of the officers, they swiftly did an about turn and headed towards us. We now saw their sun-tanned faces, their sadistically torn lips, and the spiteful glint in their eyes, all of which bode no good. Apparently the sailors were prisoners too. And they were. They were the first 30. I did say first transport. This is the official first prisoners of Auschwitz, and they receive numbers 1 to 30. They are 30 German criminals brought from Sachsenhausen. They were specifically brought over because of their cruelty. And we are going to talk more about them on the extra content episode. So if you want to head over there, I'm going to give a whole spiel on some of the prisoners and how sadistically evil some of them are. And a jewel amongst those prisoners, somebody that is not as dark as you think they would be. Stanisław Koblański also says, with the help of those in pyjamas, that's how he quotes them, in pyjamas, the Germans lined us up. One of the SS men climbed onto a stool, and with a list he began to read off our names. When your name was called, you had to shout loudly, "Here!" and run to the other side of the large yard. Every single testimony I have ever come across on the first transport talks about the first 30. Either they will mention the way that Kazimierz Albin talks about them in sailor uniforms, or they'll talk about them in pajamas. But every single one will mention how sadistic and how evil and how much they would beat. Because Bruno Broniewicz, prisoner number one, basically held a table leg and he would beat people with a table leg. Jerzy Bielecki, for example, says under the guise of forming constantly uneven rows, because by this point, these prisoners have been beaten, they've been pushed into the courtyard, and now this is what's going to continue happening. So I'm going to continue with what he says. The SS men distributed blows on all sides. They hit us in the face, head, back, and hands. They kicked us in the stomach, kidney, and shins. They walked slowly between the stiffened and terrorized prisoners, searching for new victims to torture. There were constant and silent sounds of beatings, often mixed with the groans of the battered. Bats were raised up time and time again. The weaker ones fell stunned, and I got within range of their boots. Blood mingling with sweat, stained shirts and sweatshirts. It had only just begun, and some were unable to stand on their own. Hunger, lack of water, and this beating made people otherwise healthy and strong stand at the end of physical endurance. And this is not the end, because they are going to be pushed. And we're going to talk about it in a moment. Chris is going to talk about this, about the things that they had to endure. The prisoners then listened to Lagerführer Karl Fritzsch's speech. He told them that they had come to a German camp where they're expected to be absolutely obedient and work efficiently, and that the road to freedom would lead through the chimney of the crematorium. Jews had the right to live for 2 weeks, Catholic priests a month, and the rest for 3 months. But the very interesting thing is that the crematorium didn't exist at this point yet. It would be built literally in 2 months later. So this is a little bit debated amongst historians. Did they actually use the crematorium line? Or was this then, heard by these prisoners and, put it into memory? Because sometimes when some prisoners talk about their experiences with others, unfortunately, their memory gets a bit tainted. So was that said? We don't know. I'm going to say for this episode, yes, it was. New arrivals then had all their personal belongings were taken away, their heads were shaved, they were given a bath. I want to say bath, it wasn't actually a bath. They were dunked into disinfection tanks. And you've got to remember, when they had their heads shaved, they're not being shaved with a nice little razor that you have in your bathroom. They're blunt razors. They've got cuts all over their heads. They're then registered, and on a special personal card, their details are taken, for example, their date of birth, their job, their religion, information about their type of education, their language skills, military service, and various organizational affiliations. And they also create a description of the prisoner, which includes various specific marks, teeth lost, any tattoos, any distinguishing marks. Basically, each prisoner then receives a number. They were numbered from 31 to 758. This is how prisoners are dehumanized. You take away their identity, take away everything, they become a simple number. A lot of these men also didn't recognize each other. Now, you wouldn't seem to think that, if you shaved everybody's head, I think even the lads that I'm with now, Zane and Chris, if we shaved your heads, and Zane's also got a very large beard. If we shaved Zane's beard and his head, I don't think any of us would recognize him. And this was the thing that some of them remembered, that they just couldn't recognize their friends. They were just these bald, skinny human beings, not even human beings, they were dehumanized. Their numbers were written on a piece of cloth and that were eventually sewed onto their shirts and the trousers of the prisoner stripes. And above the number, they had a small red triangle, which is, of course, we've spoken about before, is the symbol for political prisoners, because Poles were classified as political prisoners. One thing before I finish is that prisoners are not yet photographed at this point. They are photographed at the end of 1940, beginning of 1941, all the way up until the spring of 1943. But also, we do talk about this in our extra content episode, I think, Chris, don't we? For the Auschwitz Liberation podcast. Am I right on that? Yeah. So if you want to listen to us talking more about photography, because it's quite a long extra content episode, then do head for that one. And tattooing, also, tattoos are not being done till the end of 1942 at this point. The prisoners here it's all very basic, not what you usually hear when you hear about Auschwitz. Our prisoners have now come to the camp. They have been dehumanized, registered, and also told that they've only got 3 months to live. The Jews in the transport have got 2 weeks, and the priests have only got a month to live. What is ahead of them, Chris?
Well, it starts straight away. The conditions that just start getting bleaker. So after registration and disinfection, prisoners are split into groups and taken to the barracks, which are two-story, and they're divided into two halves. And although the first floor is divided into rooms, they're pretty Spartan. They've just got hay on the floor. There's no furniture. Basically, they're going to spend the night sleeping on the floor, packed in as tightly as they can get. And one prisoner recalls, "We were packed in like sardines on straw, which made it difficult to turn during the night. I was close to my brother and friends. Speaking is forbidden. For every little thing, we were beaten by the German criminals, which created an atmosphere of panic and a fear of doing wrong without meaning to. Toilet facilities is a bucket, which obviously, with the amount of people in each area, is going to quickly overflow, and there's no way to get rid of it. So the rooms are stuffy. Think about the combined body heat of all these people trapped in small rooms. You can't open a window. If you do, the guards are going to start shooting at you. It's strictly forbidden. And I mean, it's just horrific conditions. Kazimierz Albin later recalls that in the early hours, I was awoken by the noise of prisoners crowding in the corridor around a tin bucket that was already brimming. A single bucket was totally inadequate for the needs of so many people, and that was why, after midnight, the room commandants had to put out guards to deny access to it. Desperate prisoners, some of them ailing, were forced to relieve themselves into their shoes and boots. To cause the prisoners even more distress and kill their sleep, the Germans would come charging into the room late at night, often multiple times, and force them to get up, run around, and then leave them again. This causes the straw dust to rise, which gets in people's eyes and noses, makes it hard for them to breathe. But also, they're now sleep deprived as well as living in pretty barbaric conditions. This is not is going to have a serious effect on the life expectancy of quite a few of these prisoners.
The conditions just do not get any better. So, just to sum up a little bit, we have 728 prisoners that have been registered in Auschwitz. That includes a large handful of Polish Jews who have been arrested because they either joined in the resistance or they have been caught trying to cross the border, or on the other hand, they are part of Action AB, which we had spoken about in yesterday's episode. So, 728 men have now arrived at Auschwitz. They have experienced their first roll call. They have experienced registration. They are upstairs and downstairs in the Monopoly building, awaiting their further fate. And we will cover all of that tomorrow. Remember, this is 3 days, so 3 episodes only. Please head over to our Patreon, where we're going to have a very long discussion about what we've just talked about, extra content stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the 30 prisoners, the 30 German criminals. So do head over there, Moments in Time World War II edition on Patreon. So thank you so much for everyone for supporting us. Thank you so much for joining us. And we will see you tomorrow for the next episode.